Good afternoon to our panelists, delegates who have joined us for the 6th Solar Power Africa 2021 webinar in conjunction with the South Africa Energy Storage Association. I'm Neil Piper, the Head of Content for Messi Frankfurt, South Africa, and I'll be hosting the webinar today. The webinar will be addressing system benefits for energy storage. And just a few house rules. Please post your questions in the chat function. The questions will be reviewed and addressed at the end of the webinar in our Q&A session. If we can't get through all the questions, we will answer questions post the webinar on the Solar Power Africa website. A recording of the webinar will also be made available to all delegates who have joined us today in due course. It is now my pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce the panelists for our session today. They are Paul Vermeulen, he's the Chief Engineer, Renewable Energy at City Power. Vali Padiachi, the Strategic Advisor to the AMEU. And Clyde Mellinson, he's an Independent System Modeler. Just as an introduction to the webinar, Solar Power Africa is South Africa's premium exhibition and conference for the solar, PV and energy storage markets, with SAPVIA as its main endorsing association. Solar Power is scheduled to take place as a live in-person event from the 16th to the 18th of February in 2022 at the Cape Town International Convention Center. Solar Power Africa is a joint venture between Messi Frankfurt, Set Solar, who organize Solar Power International, SPI, North America's largest show for the solar and related sectors, and SNEC, the organizers of the largest solar power show in the world. Messi Frankfurt is the third largest trade fair company in the world, with an established operation in South Africa, with over 10 trade and consumer fairs in its portfolio. I would now like to welcome Paul Vermeulen, who is, as I mentioned, the Chief Engineer, Renewable Energy at City Power, who will do the formal introductions and run the webinar today. So Paul, over to you.
Thanks, Neil, and welcome to everybody. Apart from being employed at City Power, which I'm very proud of, I'm also a board member of SAESA, the Energy Storage Association, and head up the Policy and Regulation Committee there as well. But good afternoon and welcome to all. And also thank you very much to Solar Power Africa and Messi Frankfurt, South Africa, for organizing the webinar on behalf of SAESA. Energy storage is an exciting nascent industry that promises plenty in the way of mutual benefit for all in the electricity industry. And as an industry association, SAESA seeks to advance the energy storage industry in South Africa through advocacy and influence over policy where it matters. We have 5 subgroups that focus on different aspects of energy storage, the technologies available, energy storage applications, related policy and regulation, storage standards and specifications, and recently we added the electrical vehicle group because after all, an electric vehicle is just an energy storage system on wheels. We are somewhat of a young association. Of course, we would encourage all to join us. The focus of today's webinar is to explore how energy storage benefits the electricity supply system as a whole, particularly as the electricity supply transitions towards a greater proportion of renewable energy in the mix going forward. A certain proportion of energy storage will be connected to the country's electricity transmission networks, but also a fair share will be connected and embedded within the country's distribution networks, where in fact there's an added system value as you place it deeper into the distribution networks. And this is particularly true for the municipal distributors. And we feel, even a small quantity of energy storage in a single household, if it's used at the right time, can contribute to managing the stability of the grid. So it's important for distributors to promote the idea these days of creating a working grid community of consumers rather than them going completely off-grid, as often is the popular narrative. So with that said, I would then like to hand over to our first panelist, Mr. Clyde Mellinson. Thank you. Clyde, over to you.
Thanks, Paul. Afternoon, everyone. I've set myself a pretty daunting challenge today, and that challenge is to try and give you an indication of how much storage capacity I believe we need in a fully decarbonized electricity system for South Africa, how many hours of storage that would be, so capacity and energy, and then lastly, indicatively, what kind of storage or what kind of storage technologies. If I kick off by looking at this graph that I think many of you will be aware of, it's an indication of the cost reductions in wind, solar, and energy storage over the past decade and projections to the future decade. The important thing to notice is that it's on logarithmic scale, on the Y scale, which means that these cost reductions are happening at an exponential rate. And so those are some projections of what full EPC costs will be for storage, for wind, and for PV. Just note that the storage is on this particular graph is just for the DC side of things, not for the full EPC of the storage facility. Some of you will be familiar by the work done by Rethink X in North America. And I've used that as an illustration here, just to look at the annual demand of California, Texas, New England, and South Africa. And you can see from this that California is probably the closest proxy to South Africa. And the reason I put this graph up is just to illustrate that we are still quite an energy-intensive country, in that the difference between our average and our peak demand is actually quite muted. Whereas if you look at California, Texas, and New England, the difference between average hourly demand and peak hourly demand is almost twofold. Now, when we look at some of our municipalities, as Paul will attest to, we see a slightly different picture, and that is that the average to peak could also easily be twofold inside the municipal boundaries. So a key part of what I want to talk about is this diagram, which is called the Clean Energy Ucurve by Rethink X. Just to explain it very quickly, the full system cost is on the y-axis, and that U-shaped curve with the black line and the little bubbles here represents an infinite number of combinations of solar, wind, and battery systems that could supply the system 24/7, 365 with no load shedding. Now, not all of the solutions carry the same price tag, so we could choose to build more wind and solar and fewer batteries, and we would get solutions, but you can see the cost starts going up. Or we could install less wind and solar and have more storage, and the cost would also go up. And the point is that we have a sweet spot. The interesting thing about that sweet spot, if we look at California, well, it differs from region to region. For California, the sweet spot is over there. So if they install close to 4 times as much generation capacity, they would have the lowest cost situation. But a very important thing to look at here is that if you increase the cost on this axis by 10% or 20%, you get a massive increase in the amount of additional energy that you would be producing. So the answer is that there will de facto be surpluses, because in order to have no load shedding, you have to design a system for the worst days in winter. And de facto, if it can cover the worst days at the worst time of year, you will have surpluses at other times of the year. Now, I've calculated a clean energy. Let's just first of all look at South Africa. We have exceptional wind resources. This is a graph showing the average wind on a moving average every 24 hours. And you'll see there's no 24-hour period where we have zero wind output. So this is a capacity factor, and it's never zero for 24 hours, and it's got a slightly upward bowed average. If we look at solar, I've done the solar, interestingly enough, over 24 hours. Of course, we have nothing at night, but also with solar, we never have no solar. So even on those overcast days, we're probably still getting 30% solar. And you'll notice that it's bowed downwards. This is January over here. This is December. And so in winter, it's lower. And if you put the two together, you'll find that our wind, which we get more in winter and less in summer, complements the solar almost perfectly. So I've calculated a clean energy U-curve for South Africa. That's what it looks like. So this black curve, every point on that black curve is a solution of generation output. And I've done it as multiples of our current grid, which is about 231. And that's our sweet spot. So if we build a system that produces 1.65 or so of what our current grid produces, we could build it at the lowest capital cost. So what does that translate to? Oh, and then if we did that at that lowest capital cost, we would be producing about 160 odd terawatt hours of what's referred to as a superpower, which is that additional power that we get from a system that's been designed to carry us through the worst days of the year and de facto produces surplus on other days of the year. But it's still our cheapest build that we can do. Here's a table showing multiples of our current system, which is about 230 terawatt hours a year. And this one that's marked in red shows the sweet spot at 1.67, where we would have 155 terawatt hours of additional each year over and above the 231 that the grid requires. But what I want you to notice is that that system requires approximately 35 gigs of storage and 312 gigawatt hours of storage. And so that answers my first two questions. When we have a system with a grid that has no carbon emitting generation sources, we will require of the order of 300 gigawatt hours of storage. And people who know the IRP 2019 would recognize that it's about 2 orders of magnitude too little storage in the IRP. So this is 2030, if we did it all by 2030, and I'm not suggesting we can, but if we did, we would need to build 100 gigawatts of PV, 40 gigawatts of wind, and that 312 gigawatt hours of storage. And that would produce our 231 terawatt hours of our current demand, and we would have 155 terawatt hours of superpower. This is just a proposed IRP that I've drawn up. And I've suggested that by 2040, we should have our more or less 300 gigawatt hours of electricity. And I've calibrated it so that we're actually sitting at this point where we're generating 3 times our current. So I've got 230 solar, 40 wind, 35. The storage has actually gone down slightly because I've overbuilt wind and solar. And that's a suggestion. And that extra twofold would be, it wouldn't be wasted. It would be used to transition our transport system and our industrial heating and cooling from currently where there's a lot of fossil fuels used to electric mobility and electric industries. Just a quick word on the storage that will be required. The kinds, we'll have conventional electrochemical batteries, flow batteries, pump storage, including underground pump storage in old mines, in particular gold mines, high temperature thermal storage, where we could perhaps store surplus in thermal metal systems associated with old coal mines that could then create steam and drive the existing turbines, hydrogen storage, supercapacitors. I don't want to go through that today. That's not the purpose of my talk. The purpose was to indicate that the market in South Africa is there as quickly as we can to install 300 gigawatt hours of storage. And then this, I'll just finish off with this little presentation, which shows what the transition looks like. So you can see the time, the year at the top, and you'll see that our demand curve actually now adapts itself to our generation curve. And our demand will be mainly in the middle of the day when we're replenishing our batteries, and we will be generating from our storage systems in the middle of the night. Thank you.
Clyde, thank you very much. Ladies and gents, and Clyde is, of course, an independent system modeler and is also involved on several other forums, including assisting the government with energy advice. I believe it's the office of the president in some way. Clyde, is that correct?
I'm actually an advisor to the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure, but they work with Infrastructure South Africa within the presidency.
Clyde, thank you very much.
Right, thanks.
And I'm sure you're influencing the thinking in those terms as well.
I hope so. I have lots of advice to give, but I'm not always asked for it.
Clyde, the other thing that I wanted to point out was that that's a vision of the country where we've done a full transition, but at the same time, it's a journey to get there.
Correct.
So as we go through that process, also, of course, the RP already says that coal generation will get less over time as we decommission, but the value of storage is still there in terms of supporting the coal-fired power stations. At the moment, we are running storage in the form of the pumped storage systems to support coal. So any new technologies would serve the same purpose up until that point in time.
Yes, you have to, of course, have a surplus from any particular generating capacity to utilize storage. And as we all know, at the moment, our coal fleet isn't exactly cranking out a surplus.
Great. Thanks very much. Ladies and gents, with that, I'd like to hand over to Vali Padiachi, Strategic Advisor to the AMEU. So here we get a voice from the distribution industry to have a look at how storage should fit into the picture. I just need to share my screen on Vali's behalf. I presume we can all see it.
Thank you very much, Paul, and a very good afternoon to all colleagues and ladies and gentlemen. Yes, the role that I play in the AMEU, very briefly, is the Association of Municipal Electricity Utilities of Southern Africa, and we represent all metros, well, almost all metros and Munichs from a power utility perspective, and we represent about plus or minus 120 to 150. It varies constantly. Affiliates, in other words, there are private sector companies that do business in the sector, and we also have in our membership sort of parastatals and non-government entities, and we deal very closely with the public sector and the private sector. And we work very closely with government departments. The AMEU is approximately 106 years old today, not today, this year. And so it's a very established organization, go-to organization. And we are also the technical arm from a power utility perspective with SAESA. Now, with no intent to repeat, but just to give you a perspective, on the battery storage side, battery storage systems are being deployed at several levels of the electricity value chain, including transmission, distribution, and consumer levels. It hasn't really taken off because of the pricing factor, the pricing curve, but we believe that just like renewables, that price is going to come down significantly, and it's going to take off, and also the recent changes in the regulatory landscape, more in particular the increase to 100 megawatts non-licensing requirement threshold, is going to incentivize the installation of battery systems. Okay, and now these storage systems are located on the value chain, either in front of the meter or behind the meter. Now, in front of the meter, these storage systems are referred to as utility scale or grid scale battery systems. And these are connected to distribution, transmission, or even power generation assets. And battery storage systems which are in front of the meter, generally enable optimal use of the intermittency that renewables bring on, like solar PV and wind energy. Behind the meter applications refer to stationary battery storage systems installed generally at the consumer or customer location, end user customer. And these include both industrial and commercial locations. And behind the meter, batteries range in size from typically 50 kilowatts to 5 megawatts at this stage, but I think this is going to increase. Getting back to the slides, I think, and here I'm going to be focusing on behind the effects of behind the meter storage on the utility. I think that's key, because I think that's where we'll see the biggest application in the short to medium term going forward. Although there would be ingress on sort of front of the meter storage applications. So behind the meter, customers would normally be focusing on bill savings in respect of self-consumption, and then also behind the meter, a key focus would be on is to help the customers to provide backup power in case of an outage. Now, from the standpoint of utilities, meaning Metro Munich or even ESCOM, it is important not only to understand these type of customer motivations or dynamics vis-a-vis the bill savings, backup power, but to also consider importantly the implications to the utility and for the power sector. For example, as customers utilize behind the meter energy storage to alter their load and lower the electricity bill, utility revenue decreases. Okay, so that's a fact. I mean, it's been proven. However, the issue is not inherently that utilities are earning less money, but that utility costs may not be decreasing in correlation. So in other words, revenues will be decreasing, but the costs are still, I would argue, going up. And hence, as a case in point, I know Paul and I have been saying this quite often, that the kilowatt hour business model is a dead model, and we should be moving to the services model going forward. Next slide, Paul. Okay, just so focusing on behind the meter. Another potential concern and significant risk is the aspect of grid defection, which is when a customer disconnects from the main grid. Although we don't see it happening on an accelerated scale at the moment, but I think with the changes in the regulatory landscape, this phenomenon is going to be increasing. And the major impact of this is that, as we all know, the commercial and industrial customers will be the first to defect, but they also cross-subsidize the so-called less affluent customers. I don't say poor, less affluent customers. And of course, to be revenue neutral, then the utility will have to carry that cost. So this is a significant risk in terms of grid defection. Also, behind the meter energy storage can also bring benefits and new opportunities for utilities. Since behind the meter storage can reduce peak demand and alleviate stress on the system, the power system, this may provide an opportunity to defer or avoid investment in infrastructure upgrades. I think point number 9 is critically important because, as we know, the power infrastructure is asset intensive and capital intensive. So to invest capital for small peaks, small increases in peaks, may not be the right investment decision. So going forward, using energy storage can help to alleviate that, cost-effective energy storage. Okay. Also, if you look at point 11, behind the meter storage can also help to address the challenge of intermittency. I think that's a given. The sun and the wind are not there for 24 hours. So by having storage, and of course, renewables, as we know, are generated at the wrong times. The peakings are outside of the normal generation times. So if you can store at those times and then discharge at the peaking times, that's first prize, and I'll talk about that a bit more just now. Maybe Paul, if we go to the next slide. Okay, if beyond the energy storage reduces peak demand, it can consequently improve the utilities load factor, increasing system efficiency. Also, which is not in the slide, municipalities in South Africa pay a notified maximum demand fee to Eskom. And as we know, if they exceed their notified maximum demand, they get penalized significantly. In fact, we would argue that a lot of the debt of municipalities in South Africa contains a large amount of penalties coming out of notified maximum demand exceedances. So if storage is able to inject at the peaking periods, and this will help to alleviate NMD exceedances, then that's first prize for Munich. And also, so strategically, we are thinking that maybe going forward, we should not force, but incentivize or encourage IPPs coming onto the grid, that they should also install a minimal amount of storage. In fact, we were having a discussion with Clyde and Paul the other day as to what should be that magic figure. I mean, we were just thinking as an educated, informed guess that for every megawatt that you install, 30% of that should be in terms of storage. But we've asked Clyde to model that, and let's see what that figure comes up to. And at least that will, by having that minimal storage, it may help to alleviate intermittency. And also point 9, utilities can explore new service offerings for beyond the meter energy storage. And also if you look at front of the meter ancillary services, etc., there could be potential revenue streams going forward, bearing in mind that we're looking at the potential of moving our business model from a kilowatt hour to a services business model. Maybe next slide, Paul. Okay, we thought that we'll talk a bit more on the tariff arbitrage principle, because this is key to energy storage and leveraging or enhancing the benefits from energy storage or battery storage. Okay. The time of use tariffs are implemented to change the behavior of end-use customers. Okay, I think that's the key signal that gets generated, and hopefully customers adhere to that. And of course, time of use tariffs are differentiated and are expensive periods, debilitating, and that's the intent. The more you use, the more you pay. So typically when loads are high, that stress the power generators and distributed networks. Prices reduce at off-peak times. So what is arbitrage? Arbitrage, fundamentally, to the layman, is the practice of storing last night's or the previous night's off-peak cheap energy for use during today's expensive peak energy period. So fundamentally, it means if you can store the energy that's generated during the day and also able to charge the batteries from the cheap off-peak tariffs, why not? And then discharge that stored energy in the morning, say from 7 to 10, and the evening from 8 to 9 or 8 to 10. Okay, so that's first price. Okay, so just to illustrate that, using the megaflex for local authority, and if you see, for example, the peaking, it's 417 kilowatt hour. Off peak, it's about 70 cents. So that's in high demand winter. The low demand is 135, 136 cents, and off peak is 59 cents. So you can see the difference in pricing. So if you can charge, if you can use the energy at that cost to store, and then discharge it at the peaking time, you can see the savings that you can make both at the high demand season and low demand season. So this economics or commercial dynamics is referred to as arbitrage. Okay, so you store the thing. Okay, so just to further expand on that, not to go into too much of detail, just to use an example, if you look at the city power net average value of daily arbitrage is about 141. The RPU customer is about 128. The daily network and demand charge savings potential is about 59 cents from the city power LPU customer. You can see it's a significant 283. So in terms of the total potential for daily arbitrage is almost 2 rand from the city power side, but you can see here from the LPU customer is about 4.10. So depending on where you initiate the arbitrage, you can make significant savings. And Paul always says is that we should use the grid as the storage countrywide. We installed batteries, storage systems at particular nodes, power nodes countrywide, and use the grid as a storage mechanism. Paul, just the next slide, and then I'll hand over to you. Okay, this is my last slide, and I'll hand over to Paul. So, not to go into the detail of this, and I may have covered this. So, with arbitrage as a base business case for energy storage, the benefits are reducing bulk electricity purchasing costs. And I just discussed that in the previous slides, where you would, instead of buying it at about 4 rand something, you would buy it at about 70 cents. So you would save that. And obviously, by injecting some storage onto your peaking periods, you avoid NMD penalty. The bonus benefits are protecting the economy from load shedding. I think now we need it even more. If you look at, we're in the midst of stage 4 load shedding. And so we're calling this the old business UPS concept. Relieving overloaded distribution infrastructure, also to save on cost of that. Unlocking constrained property development, peak demand management, etc., etc. So with that, I want to hand over to Paul, and I'll take questions and comments later on, as guided by the moderator. Over to you, Paul.
Ollie, thanks very much. So it's quite clear that a lot of the future action, if I can call it that, is going to happen on distribution networks. Embedded generation, embedded energy storage systems. I think the distribution network is going to be where quite a lot of this happens. And obviously we still need the bulk energy storage systems connected up at transmission level, and we're still going to require Eskom's transmission network to get that diversity that Clyde was talking about between the East Coast and the West Coast. So the wind on the East Coast and the solar on the west side of the country, to give us a nice diversified mix of these new energies going forward. I think there's a fair share on transmission, and there's a fair share on the distribution network as well. So one of the things when we started to discuss the real world applications of energy storage and to try and give some actual examples of where this is happening. That's the part of the presentation that I would like to try and deal with. So the first question really is to say, what do electricity customers want? And of course, it's uninterrupted, continuous and reliable supply, always on. That's key. That's definitely one of the first prizes that everybody would want. At the same time, also, they want lower electricity costs. And nowadays, also, there are energy options, and the customers actually want the freedom to exercise those options. Cleaner energy supply with lower impact on climate change. We've got quite a few customers that are under huge pressure from their shareholders to find cleaner sources of energy. And it's clear to me that energy storage is a key enabler for both the customers and the distributors' objectives, and for that matter, the national system operators' objectives. So there's this mutual benefit and mutual need. So let's have a look at some of the real world examples. On the first slide I've got here is the property developer and storage. And this is an example of the Chamberlins Hardware store in Strubens Valley. So what happened here is that a developer came along and applied for 150 kVA new service connection for a new mega store. Unfortunately, our network was constrained in that area and we were only able to offer them 100 kVA's worth of capacity. The developer came back with a proposal to take the 100 kVA available and also install a PV system together with an energy storage system as a solution. We agreed to that proposal, and the idea behind this is that off-peak nighttime energy from City Power is used to charge the energy storage to power the business from 7 a.m. until 9 a.m. when the sun comes up nicely and starts shining strong. The PV generation would be strong enough to make up the shortfall over the day and also recharge the energy storage for after 4 p.m. when the business reverts to the battery until the business closes at 6 p.m. And this repeats every day. So the cost of the combined solar plus storage in this case was overcome by the benefits of being able to establish this new store. And the other benefit there is that the city has a new rate-paying business. We must never forget that the development of property comes with the creation of a ratepayer. And also City Power has a new customer with a remarkably flat load profile, which is exactly what we want. And the same concept can, in fact, apply to residential developments. I've got a slide that details that as well. So on the commercial and industrial sector side of things, City Power wants to initiate a business community project, essentially, where we can try and overcome the issue of load shedding together. We're entering that phase, like while he said, the kilowatt hour business is literally dead. So we're entering a phase where it's a collaborative effort between the distributor and the end customer. So the idea here is for us to promote the investment in energy storage by our key customers, okay? And the principle behind this is that the storage is used for daily arbitrage duty, and that is the base business case for the energy storage system. The high cost of unserved energy, which is business dependent on what business you're in, creates the second business case for making this investment. So here's an opportunity to get megawatt scale energy storage facilities in at key customer sites. And the idea here is to deploy the energy storage with plug and play modular containerized solutions available from the energy storage industry. A lot of the guys in the industry have already developed these concepts. Containerized thing they can come and put down at a business and operate that business as a microgrid. We've seen quite a few examples of that already. So this scheme provides immediate relief from load shedding for the participants. The site's connected to the distributor SCADA system, and the idea there is to aggregate the systems from day one. Okay. When a critical mass is reached, the distributor can dispatch the stored energy and won't in fact need to load shed anybody on the grid. When load shedding is a thing of the past, the idea is that the distributor will bid that aggregated storage capacity into a demand response market. Eskom already has such a thing up and running, and that will be with the future new ISMO. So here's a way to protect the economy, but all it requires is convincing our customers to make this investment right now. Then we can expand that to the sectional title residential sector. So what we've seen already First of all, the sectional title residential sector makes up a significant contribution of that evening peak demand problem. After all, it's the residential consumer that gets home, switches on the stove, switches on the geyser, uses hot water, etc., that creates that evening peak. And the beauty of the sectional title complex is that there's a body corporate that can act as an agent to in fact make this happen. And what we've seen is energy services companies are offering whole complex UPS systems using lithium-ion battery packs. Obviously, the selling point here is the supply continuity that comes from this. And the energy package can also include PV panels to provide lower cost energy overall, as well as to recharge the batteries, similarly to what Vali had mentioned previously. The beauty of this is that the sites are already time of use migration ready. Distributors can partner with body corporates and energy services companies to move the whole sector onto time of use tariffs. And that will effect a positive load profile change for the municipality or the distributor. Where successful, there's this mutual benefit as costs reduce for both end consumer and the distributor, and even a conservative uptake in those areas where we have critical substation zones that are right at the loading limit. Even a conservative uptake will help reduce that evening peak problem and reduce outages due to overloads. The middle to upper income residential sector, the private income sector, residential sector, here, the ISH market reports that South Africa is the 6th largest residential energy storage market in the world. Quite an amazing fact, in fact. 200 megawatts worth of 200 megawatts hours worth of capacity was delivered in 2020, largely to avoid the inconvenience of load shedding. So what's happened on the city power networks is that we've got a lot of unregistered systems, and it's an issue that we need to solve to get our customers to actually convert to the residential time of use tariff. There was a project done by University of Johannesburg and the C40 organization where we used artificial intelligence to analyze satellite images to identify where these PV systems were installed. And we found that there are 6,000 of them already on the city power networks. So once we've gone through a program to normalize these installations and migrate these customers onto the time of use tariff that they should be on, we would in fact, and if each is only able to reduce the demand by 1 kilowatt hour during a peak period, during a 2-hour evening peak period, we would already have 6 megawatt hours demand reduction and energy shift of 12 megawatt hours. And that translates to a value of 5.2 million per annum, very similar to the way that a ripple control geyser system works. The only difference is that the beauty of an energy storage system as opposed to ripple control on a geyser is that you can wait a few hours before you recharge the energy storage system. Whereas with the geyser, you've got to recharge it immediately after the evening peak. Otherwise, you end up with cold water problems. And that's the story from my side. We're now going into the question and answer session. And please, if anybody is interested, there's the website for SAESA. Please go and have a look. And if you'd like to become a member, climb on the email address at the bottom there. Thanks very much. Right, if I can invite the audience there to type the questions into the Q&A, the chat session. I've got that open up, and we'll have a look and pass the questions on to the relative party or the targeted panelists. Thank you. Right, I see a question there from Kevin Poulton. Kevin, can you email the presentation to us? As far as I know, that will be the case. We will make the link available. Neil, I think if I can pass over to you there.
Yes, we will be sharing the recording of this, and the presentations will be available on the website.
Right, Neil, I don't see any additional questions. Am I looking?
Paul, have a peep in the chat. Have a peep in the chat column. Some people have posted questions in the chat column.
All right.
Some people being Brian Day, that is.
Okay, I see it from Brian. From Brian Day, why do you call renewable energy intermittent? In fact, there is little that is unexpected in terms of renewable energy output. There are substantial levels of predictability which differs per technology and time frame in renewable energy. Therefore, one needs a nuanced understanding of the variability of renewable energy rather than incorrectly terming it intermittent, which suggests an unexpected drop to zero. Brian, I'd like to answer that in a way. I agree with you that when you include the diversity of renewable energy spread geographically, it is far less intermittent, and in fact, your terminology is probably the better one, variability. But I must say at the same time that we have seen over Joburg, you know, those days where you've got these puffy little white clouds that come over. We have seen very intermittent output from renewables. So when you're looking just at a single municipality, it does, I think the term intermittent does have a little bit of a better meaning from that point of view. I hope that answers the question, but certainly I think you're quite right. It can be planned for, and especially if you've got some storage in your back pocket, that planning is a lot easier, and you can make it a lot firmer than what it's perceived not to be. Clyde, do you have an input there as well?
Yeah, I was just saying people generally call puffy white clouds, the cumulonimbus type, as transient interruptions to solar PV. And certainly, whether your storage is at the PV site or anywhere in the system, one of the roles of storage is to respond almost immediately to cloud transients. And so you will notice in my presentation that I'm not sure if people have fully got their heads around. I'm talking about 300 gigawatt hours of storage in South Africa by 2040. Now that storage will include both behind the meter and in front of the meter storage. So, you know, if 1 million homes each put in 10 kilowatt hours, that translates to about 10 gigawatt hours, if my maths is correct, of storage, and we need 300 gigawatt hours. So it just changes everything. If City Power had, let's say, I don't know, 300 megawatts of storage, and there were some puffy clouds coming over, shading some of the residential PVs, that storage could kick in and rectify that, and you wouldn't even notice it, basically. So in other words, the storage devices then switch from perhaps being charged by excess midday solar on household rooftops, and they go into discharge mode or they simply charge less, but they basically act as shock absorbers to cloud transients. So I like the term variability, but predictable variability. I've still to find someone who doesn't understand the cycle of the sun. I think the ancients knew it. When it comes up each day of the year, when it goes down, and we can predict that there won't be any sunlight at midnight with a high degree of accuracy. In fact, with greater accuracy, then we can predict whether there will be fish getting into the intake pipes at Ucurve, if you want to put it in those terms. And when that happens, you lose 800 megawatts, not 6,000 residential systems of solar. So yes, it's very predictable, but we understand that it's variable, but not actually as variable as people make out if it's complemented with storage. In fact, if you complement it with the right amount of storage, it's not variable at all.
Thanks, Clyde. I see another question there from Brian Day. Paul, are you saying that your clients can choose to change to a time of use tariff so as to maximize the value of potential for storage? This would be body corporate type clients, specifically flats with multiple units at each location. Brian, thanks for the question, because our commercial and industrial customers can immediately go onto the time of use tariff. We do have a residential time of use tariff as well, and that would be extended to the body corporates as well. But I must caution that is still in development, so I can't give it to you tomorrow. But the idea is to get that in place and offer it to the sectional title properties. I see another question from Portia. Hi, Paul. Is there an existing study or perhaps an installation done on sectional title residential units? Portia, the picture in my slide is in fact a sectional title establishment in Ekurhuleni. And what I can do is connect you to the energy services company that in fact installed that. I will do that for you. If I can ask you to please send me your email address, I will do that for you.
Paul, can I just come in there?
Yes, by all means, Wally.
Yeah, just I want to go back to storage in the context of what Clyde mentioned, 2040 and beyond. I'm hoping that by 2040, that green hydrogen would be at a level, pricing level that's very competitive. I think the US, as we know, with Biden's new target of, I think he's called it the 111 concept, $1 of 1 kilogram green hydrogen in 1 decade. So it's 111. So in 10 years' time, they're expecting to get to at least $1 or less. And so if that comes to fruition, which I think it would, if you look at where it's going, then we could get, from a utilities perspective, if I use my AMU at, that because there's a debate that's starting to come up, whether we use the normal battery storage that we all know of versus fuel cells, for example, using green hydrogen. And the impact of that, especially on front of the meter services, ancillary services, etc. So I think we must always keep that in our radar. That I think in the next decade we could get, or even less than that, get to a stage where we could get to using green hydrogen as a means. And as you know, South Africa is best positioned for green hydrogen, given our abundance of supply of platinum, and also we've got the best sunshine in the world. So with about 85% of platinum, best sunshine in the world, and with the unlocking of the regulatory landscape, we could have an abundance of renewable energy coming onto the grid. And so the strategic intent of power to X, power to hydrogen, could be a viable option. And I know our government is putting a lot of emphasis on that, DTI, Department of Science and Innovation, etc., etc. And so I think from a storage aspect, the impact of that, we must also factor in. Back to you, Paul.
Thanks, Wally. Clyde, you got a comment there? Because I think that speaks very strongly to your superpower or your surplus that you talk about in your model there.
Yeah, I do have a comment. I'm a I see a hydrogen economy as part of our future economy, but I differ from Valley in that I don't see it as playing a big role in storage to generate power. That's something that's of far more concern to countries who have a much bigger interseasonal disconnect than what we do. So in countries like Europe, they need to see themselves through long, dark winters. So they need long duration storage. All of my modeling indicates in South Africa that we don't need more than about 8 hours of storage. So we need a lot of capacity, 35 gigs or so, for about 8 hours. You don't need longer. And hydrogen storage, it's expensive to store hydrogen. And if you're only going to use it on rare occasions, then it's not very efficient going from electricity to hydrogen back to electricity. It's a bit like going from coal to steam to make hot water kind of thing, as opposed to thermal direct, if you can see the analogy. So I prefer to see hydrogen in the form of shipping it to Europe to help keep our northern neighbors warm in winter, while we luxuriate in our wonderful winter sunshine in South Africa. And that will be the route that I see happening, and also to decarbonize heavy industries like steel production and cement production by the use of hydrogen rather than by the use of coal as a reductant. So we're blessed by not having to concern ourselves with long duration storage. And by long duration, I mean inter-week and even in some cases inter-seasonal storage.
Paul, if I could just come in there, just to clarify. Yes, Clyde, fully agree. When I made that comment, it was more that once we get to that level of abundance of green hydrogen, cost effective, it's more the aspect of coupling of sectors. So I agree, it's using that stored hydrogen for example, the production of ammonia, the transportation sector, and that's key to us here in Africa, South Africa, from job creation. And I think yes, the DTI is actually promoting that, where we couple sectors as opposed to beneficating within the sector. So I agree with you. And, yes. Yes,
yeah.
exactly.
The really exciting part, of course, is finding industries that can benefit from low marginal cost surplus electricity. That's what it boils down to. And essentially EVs, electrification of transport, is one such yes, industry where they don't have to charge on demand, as it were. You don't have to charge your electric car every day. And so in future, you'll be charging your car in the middle of the daytime when we're producing most of our electricity. And if it's used to inject into the grid at all, it will be injecting into the grid in the middle of the night, which is exactly the inverse of what the current situation would be if you were a time of use customer.
Exactly, yeah.
Gents, thanks very much. So clearly we agree there, because this mobile load, and that's why SAESA included electric vehicles in the picture, are actually going to be within our distribution networks, Valley. So I believe there's a benefit for all. There's a future load coming there as well. And certainly I think it's going to be unlocked by, we all know that technology exists. The trick now is to build the business cases and to get energy storage on the networks as quickly as we can. Even though at the moment we are short of primary energy, it creates the opportunity and takes off the pressure that we see at the moment. Ladies and gents, I would like to then hand back to Neil. I don't see any more questions there, although there was one for short burst electrical storage. What are your views of compressed or liquid air storage? And that's from Yan Lee. Yan Lee, SAESA is technology agnostic. Wherever that application could fit in, we would also promote that from that point of view. Neil, over to you to close off. Thank you very much.
Paul, thank you so much. And Valley and Clyde, thank you very much for your insights today. I thought it was a really interesting conversation, and I'm sure the conversation is going to continue as we head forward. But to all of our delegates, thank you so much for attending the Solar Power Africa and SAESA webinar. I think it was an important topic that we've breached today, and we sincerely hope that the webinar imparted some useful knowledge and answered a few of your questions. As I mentioned, we will send everybody that was part of the webinar a recording of the webinar. You'll get that shortly, and then the presentations we'll have on the Solar Power Africa website. And then just to end, please look out for our next webinar. That's going to be hosted on the 5th of November. And this is an interesting one that's going to focus on vehicle to grid technology. And Clyde, it goes exactly into what you were talking about now. So that's on the 5th of November. Please join us then. And thank you, everybody, and take care.